Today is the 15th of June 2011 and I am interviewing Rene Nash, who as a very young girl resided with her parents in the Netherlands East Indies, and in 1942 the family became captives of the Japanese when they invaded. Rene's father became a prisoner of war, whereas her mother, herself and her brother became civilian internees. But I think it is better that you hear the story from Rene. Rene, thank you very much for agreeing to do this interview today. And I've done a little introduction, but if you could tell us when you were born, where you were born, and a little bit about your parents.
Sure. I was born in Bandung in Indonesia, which is just out of Jakarta, in 1938. My father originally went to Indonesia to take up a position with a company called Fuchs and Rens, a motor sales business that he worked in, and sent for my mother some time later, and they were actually married in Jakarta at the time. Mm-hmm. That's how she then became pregnant, and I was actually born there then, mm-hmm. After which we went on long service leave back to the Netherlands, where the war broke out. They managed to return to Indonesia. My brother was born a year later, but he was actually born in Jakarta. And from there on in, of course, the Japanese started to invade Indonesia as such, and we were consequently interned, and my father was trucked across to somewhere. We didn't find out too many years later that he actually went to the Burma railway line, mm-hmm. where he passed away.
And your father was in the Netherlands East Indies Army, was he?
Yes.
And what rank was he?
He was a sergeant in the army.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Right. Now, what happened to your mother and yourself? And was your brother born now that I think you did say, whilst you're in captivity?
No, he was born just prior to, because obviously we didn't go into internment until about 1942.
All right.
Before we went into the camps.
Mm-hmm.
By that time I was about 4 years old, and my brother a year younger.
Yes.
Yes, the three of us went into internment from there. And
which camp were you in at first?
We were in Camp Chideng,
yes.
in Jakarta.
Uh-huh. And what sort of accommodation did you have?
From what I remember, because people need to remember that I was only very young, and I'm not sure whether some of the things that I'm talking about I actually do remember, or whether I was told over and over again and it's been stuck in my mind ever since. I remember there being 21 people in one house, all women. We would have been the two youngest children there. Most of the girls that were in the house with us were teenagers, 18, 19 years old. The only people that stand out from that was a Russian woman with two daughters. Her surname was Donskoy, Mrs. Donskoy, and her two daughters, Rose and Tus. I believe they also immigrated to Australia in later years, but we've never been able to find them.
Yes. Now, one thing I didn't ask you earlier was, what was your maiden name?
My maiden name was Brede.
Yes.
I've been married twice. First time round, my surname was Todd, and then I remarried when the girls were a bit older, and I became Rene Nash.
Now, going back to when you're in the camps, in your first camp in in Java.
Yes.
Was your mother forced to work for the Japanese?
Not as much in saying that she worked for the Japanese. They had to work for their own benefit, meaning we had to grow vegetables and tend to the grounds within the camp to enable us to be fed with other than rice.
Yes.
So they worked basically for the Japanese, but for their own benefit as well.
And what about yourself? Did you have schooling?
Schooling, as far as I can remember, we used to meet with a couple of nuns in the camp, and we used to sit on the pavement and we would draw our alphabet on the pavement with charcoal or limestone, whatever we could get hold of, because pens, pencils were a no-no. And we learned to count and recognise colours by boxes of buttons that the women had gathered together. That was my early days of schooling.
Yes.
Then post-war I went to a schooling where in the mornings schooling was taught in Dutch, and in the afternoons it was done in Indonesian, so hence I became bilingual, and that was my primary school education.
Now, did you move to any other camps during the period that you were civilian internees?
No, we stayed where we were.
Yeah. How would you describe the way you were treated by the Japanese?
As children, not too badly. We were afraid of them because occasionally the guards on the outside of the Atap fence line would stick their bayonets through if we came too close to the Atap, because we were curious and wanted to know what was on the other side of the Atap fence. So we would kind of dig holes into it to try and peer out. Well, you know, you had to keep your distance. That's the only sort of awkward things I remember. Mostly they treated us okay. The occasional sweet was handed over, and because I was very young, so I guess I didn't see some of the evil things that they did. I do remember sometimes our camp commander, whose name was Sone, he was reputed to have moon sickness, so on a full moon he'd just go on a rampage, and his favourite trick would be to wake everyone up and have us get together out in the open and stand for hours, and there was no fainting or falling over or anything like that. Punishment would be that the women would have their head shaven if they did anything that didn't appeal to him. Only other thing I recall is being awfully hungry at times.
Okay.
And one of his tricks would be, in a rage, cooking was done in big drums because it had to supply all of the camp.
Yes.
The children did get some milk. It was condensed milk, watered down into a liquid.
Yes.
And we had a cupful per day. That was all we got. Our main diet was rice, spinach leaves, which we called kangkung. Of course, lots of chilies and corn, because things do grow prolifically in those areas.
Yes.
Now, if he was in a really bad mood, he would kick over the big drums of rice cooking, and that would be the rice wasted for the day, and people went hungry. My mother somehow managed to make some sort of bread out of starch and flour, and we would cry in the night, being starving, and she would have a piece of this bread under my pillow. It was so tough, you had to suck it, but it kept the hunger at bay until the next meal rocked up.
Now, did you sleep in a dormitory, or did you have a room? And how many people were in the room, if you were?
We had a room, just mother and the two children, and the others split all rooms up to whatever way it suited them.
And did you have a bed?
A camp bed.
Yes.
You know, the camp stretchers.
A stretcher.
Like the army
yeah.
would have. That's all we had.
Yes. A pillow.
Pillow we did have.
Blankets.
Yes. Just a rug.
Just a rug. What about your clothing?
Clothing, whatever my mother managed to bring into a great big trunk, that's what we had. And it was remade as you grew bigger from other people's clothing.
And did she have access to a sewing machine or anything like that?
No, all done by hand.
All done by hand. Yeah. Now, Rene, was he your camp commander for the whole time, or did he come later?
I only remember him
Yes.
being the sole person
Yes.
in charge of the camp.
Yes.
I believe he was arrested and hung post-war for war crimes that he committed.
Yeah.
I couldn't go into details of just exactly what war crimes he committed, but we did get news that he was actually hung.
Now, that brings another point up. Did you see anything that he did that would have warranted him being executed?
I didn't, being
No.
far too young yet again, because I would have been probably about 7 or 8 years old by the time we were freed and able to move on.
Did you have footwear the whole time?
Yes. Sandals and clogs, you
Yes.
know, the typically Indonesian wooden clog things.
Yes. Now, the nuns, were they active in your camp, and were they good?
I don't recall a lot about them other than that we saw them in the mornings for our schooling. Apart from that, they obviously had a very low profile. Whether they stayed during the internment time, I'm not sure.
Did you have religious services?
We didn't attend any, no.
No. Now, did you actually did you learn the Japanese language or yourself?
No, only the orders of going on parade and standing at attention, bowing,
Yes,
and that sort of thing. They're the only words that we ever learned.
yes.
There was really no need to learn to speak their language because they used to sign if we displeased them,
Yes.
if anything.
Did you, if anyone was ill in your camp, who looked after them? Did you have any doctors, female doctors in the camp or anything like that?
I don't know.
No.
I truly don't know.
Now, do you remember the end of the war? Do you remember when you first became aware that the war was over?
According to a map that I've got here, there were whispers going around that the men were being freed and were coming back, and they were heading back towards Camp Chideng. And I recall us waiting at the gates for the men to trickle back in and looking for my dad, who never returned. Then eventually the up fencing was taken down and we were able to find housing and get back to some sort of normality, back into the workforce for my parents.
When did you become aware that your father had died?
Not until the end of the war, before they opened the gates, which would have been about 44, 45,
Yes.
before we were let free.
Yes.
And it wasn't until then that we realised that Dad wasn't coming back.
Yes.
Now I believe, from what I've been told, that it was the Red Cross people who actually contacted my mother to verify the fact that he had passed away on the Burma Railway line.
Yes, yes. And that would have been the first time you had any idea that he'd gone up there.
Yes. The first thing we remember of Dad being taken away was that the Japanese were loading the men onto trucks. And
railway trucks or motor vehicle trucks?
Motor vehicle trucks. You know, they were all piled on the tray at the back. I remember one Japanese fellow coming over to where the women and children were standing watching the men being taken and signing that I could go and say goodbye to my father, but I was so terrified of the men that I never dared go. So I missed my opportunity, which to this day I regret it that I never did go and kiss my dad goodbye.
Yes, I can understand that. Talking about the Japanese, did you ever have any impression that some of the Japanese were reasonable?
As I was getting older, I realised that war is an awful thing and men are recruited to be part of the army, whether they want to be or not. I have learned to tolerate the Japanese in a sense, although I still don't particularly like them. But I guess as you become more mature, you realise that it isn't often their own choices, that they are recruited into the army, same as our men were. And the atrocities that happened in those days were all part and parcel of war. But it's hard to forgive because I lost the most precious man in my life, you know.
Yes. Now, is there anything that sticks in your mind as something that was particularly bad or brutal that you observed the Japanese doing?
As a child, when we first went into internment, we were allowed to keep our pets. There were people that had birds, chickens, ducks, you name it. We had a German Shepherd, which was my dog, which I'd had since I was born, and it was my guard. And towards the end of the war, Sone decided he wanted our dog, and it was give him the dog or the dog would be destroyed, because in the meantime I believe people were killing their chickens and their birds as a source of meat. I remember being terribly, terribly distressed about our dog, his name was Lutz, being taken away by Sone. Post-war, the last we heard of the dog, we went looking for him. He was taken to Bandung, and whatever happened to him from there, I have no idea. That was probably the worst thing I remember as a child.
Yes.
My pet being taken away.
Yes.
For no apparent reason.
Yes.
Just he wanted him, and he got him.
Yes. With the war being over, I'm aware that your mother, once the death of your father was known, she remarried.
Yes.
About what time, what year was that?
That was in 1946.
Yes. And did you stay in the Netherlands East Indies, or where did you go to from there?
Yes, we stayed there. My mother worked for a lady called Mrs. Groeneberg. She was a Dutch-Indonesian woman who had a jewellery store. And my mother worked for her for many, many years. Until Sukarno was in power and decided the Dutch were to either take Indonesian nationality or return to where they came from. And we opted to return to Holland at that stage.
Yes. Now, just before we get to your return to Holland, you did tell me on one occasion something about the currency. What happened to the...
Originally, when we were told that we were to return, first of all, Sukarno decided he didn't want the Dutch Queen's head on the paper currency. So he had us cut our money literally in half, and we were given bonds to the value of the half that was destroyed. So most of the Dutch then finished up with half their fortune
Yes.
they accrued. The bonds, we did bring them over to Australia, still no value to them. Then some of the money, I believe, was being trickled through to repay what they'd lost. But in the meantime, there were some Dutch people who didn't know about money being repaid, who bought these bonds for next to nothing. And my mother did sell the bonds that she held at the time. But that happened here.
Yes, yes. Now, but before you came to Australia, did you not? You returned to Holland, did you?
Yes.
Yes. About what year was that?
That would have been 1950.
Mm-hmm.
We only stayed in Holland for a couple of years because we were aliens there. We were called the yellow people, strangely enough, only because of the tanning that we acquired in the Dutch East Indies turned yellow in the colder weather in the Netherlands. So they used to call us the yellow people. Quite strange. Very upsetting as a teenager.
And where did you live while you were there?
We were in Scheveningen, which is a harbourside town from The Hague. We had a room or an area upstairs with other people.
Yes, yeah. And was life difficult?
It was, because neither of my parents could get work. I did get some schooling there, which they called an overbruggingsschool, which was a type of school where if you hadn't completed formal schooling because of the war years, you were sent to this particular school where you had primary and high school students attending, as well as teenage boys, 18, 19-year-olds who had probably done some time in the army but never had the opportunity to complete their schooling. So it was quite a mixed bag of young people being educated there.
Now your mother had married in the meantime, and when was how come the family ended up in Australia? What was?
Life was tough in the Netherlands, unable to get work. It was cold, which we weren't used to. And at the time, in the 50s, there was a lot of immigration happening. And the opportunities were in Canada or Australia. So my mother and stepfather applied for both. And Australia came up first, hence we finished up in Australia.
Yes, yeah. And did you come to Perth?
Yes,
initially?
we came straight to Perth.
Yeah.
On the ship coming over, they gave us the opportunity, if we had relatives in Perth, we could actually disembark. And we did disembark because my stepfather went ahead and had acquired work in Perth as such. So we disembarked at Fremantle. And our first home in Australia was in Hay Street in East Perth, which was a huge place, not far away from the Royal Mint, where it stands today. And just up from there was the Deaf and Dumb Institute. We had a house not far from there. It was huge. Yet again, finances were short because we finished up with landing money, which at the time was £60 for the family, and my stepfather was very much behind in paying rent, so that went. Mum, being very innovative, decided there were so many rooms in this house and we had to pay this astronomical rent, she'd start a boarding house for young men. And there were plenty of those immigrating here looking for work and looking for a fortune. So we ran a boarding house for 21 young men for a few years.
That would have helped, I imagine.
It was fun.
So
I loved it.
where did you start? Did you commence primary school in Perth?
No, I went straight into high school, even though I didn't speak the language. They kind of assessed me and decided I had enough education to go into high school. So I finished up at Perth Girls High School, where I did a little bit of first year high and moved on to second year high. Past that, got into third year high, and at the end of the day was politely asked to leave because I was a bit of a rebel in them days. And
were you still living in Hay Street at that time?
at that time, yes, we were. Yeah. We stayed there until we applied for state housing, and they sent us off to Copeland Drive in Belmont during a waiting period to see whether you qualified for a home or not, which we eventually did, and moved house and went to Bentley, where Mum and Uncle Harry purchased a home, state housing home.
Yes.
In Bentley.
Yeah. Do you want to have a break for a moment?
I'm fine.
Okay, that's good. Now you told me about an incident concerning clothing that occurred at Perth Girls High School.
Looking back, it was funny, but at the time, very sad. I went to Perth High School in civilian clothing. You have to remember in those days we wore a navy blue uniform with white shirts, tie. We didn't have that kind of funding. So I was sent home, not to return until I managed to acquire a uniform. Mother, being very upset that I would miss schooling, decided to rip up the Dutch flag that she had, made me a navy blue skirt with a white top and a red sash, and back I went to school to be sent home yet again to acquire a proper uniform before returning. Somehow I believe Mother found the funding to dress me in a proper uniform.
And who was the person that made that decision that you would?
It was a headmistress called Miss Wright, a very stern woman. Rules were rules, and you abided by them.
Yes.
And that was the way it went, I'm afraid.
Now, just tell us where Perth Girls High School was.
Perth High School was on top of the hill, close to the racetrack and the East Perth Cemetery. It is currently a police station in the city of Perth. It's along Wellington Street.
Rather a grand building.
It's beautiful, yeah.
So after Perth Girls, where did you go to?
After Perth Girls, I worked for a little while. We were still in Hay Street then, and there was a little Greek shop, a deli, opposite the Grosvenor Hotel. The man there was very kind and gave me a little job where I could weigh up potatoes in bags for a small pocket money, basically. I then finished up eventually working for Walsh's men's clothing store in the office.
In Hay Street?
Yes. They actually taught me switchboard, the machines to do the accounting, and I worked with a Mr. Musk, who has since passed away. He was my accountant, boss man, very kind person. He had twin boys, and would you believe, in later years one of his sons became a doctor in the respiratory ward at Sir Charles Gardner, where I met with him again when his grandfather was passing away.
Yes.
He remembered me as a teenager working for his firm,
Yes.
the Walsh Company, and working for his dad, of course.
Now, when did you get married?
I got married in the 60s, first time. Was divorced. I adopted my first daughter at the age of 7 months, and I divorced my first husband when she was 14. By the time the decree nieces came through, I'd met my second husband, and we were married not long after that, in the 70s.
And when did you must have become a housewife for a period of time, did you, or did you work all the way through?
I worked all the way through because we then, with the children, rented a house in Bentley, which was walking distance from my mother's place. And so my mother looked after the girls while I went to work. Eventually, later in my age, I decided I still had this wish to be a nurse. I never realised that because we had to live in, and our parents didn't allow us to live in away from home. So I finally went nursing in 1970 and did my enrolled nurses course, completed that, worked at Royal Perth, Shenton Park, Hollywood, and eventually finished up at Charlie's as an enrolled nurse specialising in orthopaedics.
And do you remember the names of any of the doctors who you worked with?
Not really, because as an enrolled nurse you didn't have that much access. I spent a lot of time on the spinal unit, where of course Mr. Eddie Barn was one of our main physicians, and Sir George Bedbrook of course had the spinal unit, who became a friend because I married one of his patients in the 70s.
Right. So that was at Shenton Park, was it, when you were with the Bedbrook?
Yes, Ward 11. Sir George finished up in later years very ill in intensive care in Sir Charles Gardner, where he passed away. Yes,
yeah. Now, if you were trying, when you married your husband, who has since passed away, when was that?
That was in 74.
Yeah, and what did he do? What
he was a dental technician. Because he was wheelchair bound, he was paraplegic.
Yes.
Perth wasn't very accessible to wheelchairs at the time, and we really struggled to get him back into the workforce from a wheelchair. He was very lucky. He applied for a couple of jobs, did some private jobs. We set a lab up at home with help from an Air Force friend who managed to access reject tools and equipment from the RAF. Eventually Alan managed to get a job at Royal Perth Dental, where they set up a bench for him. And he worked with them for several years until he became...
This was at the dental hospital, was it?
Yes.
Yeah, in Wellington Street.
In Wellington Street. Vic Square.
Does the name Lynn Pearman mean anything to you?
John Pearman?
Lynn.
No, it doesn't. I know John Pearman.
Yeah, she was the head of nurses, the Don.
Oh, okay.
What were the circumstances of your husband becoming a paraplegic?
He had a motorcycle accident one evening. He was coming back from getting a Chinese meal, trying to, on his motorbike, cross Railway Parade in Bentley, and there's a no-through road or a no-through section there, and he hit the curb and came off his bike and broke his spine consequently.
Yeah. Now, I suppose we will move on to present times.
Yes.
How long have you been living in this village, this development?
I moved into the village a couple of years after Alan passed away, because we were living in Heathridge and we'd been there about 8 years, and the house was on 3 levels, just becoming too difficult to manage on my own.
Mm.
So I went to a real estate agent, originally looking for a duplex house. There didn't seem to be anything within my financial range.
Mm.
And the real estate lady took me to have a look here.
Mm.
And I kind of liked the concept of the village. It was
Mm.
secure. I was ready to retire anyway at that point in time. So I sold the Heathridge home and came in with enough funding to be able to purchase here.
Yes. Yeah.
And I've been here 3 years
Mm.
now.
Mm. Now, I think, is there anything that you want to particularly tell me to have recorded on this video interview?
Peter, I haven't. I've very much appreciated your support, your ability to help me along with this. I'm so glad I've been able to get some of this stuff out of my system. And I thank you very much.
It's my privilege. What we'll do, we'll stop now, and I want to get that embroidery, and I want to film that, and I'll get you to explain it.
Sure you can.
Rene, I would wonder if you would mind explaining this piece of artwork that we've got in front of us. I'm just going to scan over the entire image, and then it's in your hands as you explain various scenes there.
All right, it was drawn on a piece of canvas. It's a material that was used for making vests and pants to match. The original label is still on the back. However, moving on from there...
What about the camp name too?
Now we have the gates at Camp Chideng, which was the camp name where
Yes.
we were interned. Over here you'll see the camp number as it was registered as.
Yes.
And from there there is an area whereby the women have obviously shown you some of the chores that they had to perform.
Yeah, okay, so can you do them in order for me?
This one here is wash day.
Mm-hmm.
You can see the buckets and the basin, and this is the washboard here that they used.
Yes.
That's how they did their washing. Then they had garden duties where they had to clean up the pavers and what have you. Then from there, it says here, of course it's all written in Dutch, 3 of us in a box measuring 2 meters 80 square.
And that was your room that you
That was
occupied?
the room that we occupied.
Yes.
To 21 people
Yeah.
in one home.
And what's that?
This here portrays the weekly moving from place to place. I can't tell you whether we actually moved or whether we moved from room to room. Obviously with a hand cart, a couple of suitcases and bits and pieces that people just moved on.
Yep.
Question mark here, where are we going to this time? This here gives us the name of a place. I can't tell you what it's about. It says Tangerang Grogol Gedung Badak.
Mm-hmm.
I have no idea what that entails. It may well have been a place where we were going to.
Mm-hmm.
Over here is the, whenever called, parade. The orders were Jiotsuke, standard attention, Kere, bow, Naore, straighten yourself up, obviously.
Mm.
Down here is a little area showing the women having to dig the soil for planting
Yes.
some of the vegetables we have.
Yes.
Now right in the corner here, as we're heading back out to the gates, there is a little note here that says future whispers. So obviously the women had some idea at that stage that the men were coming back out of their internment wherever they were sent at the time. This is the only thing that I've got left from those days. That Now, I'd like people to now have a look at the one and only photograph I have of my father, Peter Breday, his wife, my mother, Baldwina Maria Breday. Otten was her surname prior to marriage, and she's holding yours truly as a young baby.
You look pretty healthy there.
Yes, pretty chubby, aren't I? I'd like to introduce you to a young woman whose mother was our cook during our time in Indonesia. She was brought up in a convent. She came to us at the age of 16 and became basically our nanny. To me, she was my sister. She's approximately 16 years older than myself. She finished up marrying a Dutch army fellow, and eventually when the policy in Australia changed, she did come to Australia with her 3 daughters, Marjolaine, Annelies and Trixie. I have lost touch with her. I really don't know if she's still alive. I know her husband has since passed away. Then a friend of mine managed to retrieve from Thailand my father's headstone, which gives his date of birth and his date of death. He's buried in Kachinabura in Thailand. And yet again, Peter, I have to thank you for making this wonderful effort of being able to produce this for me.
Well, it's been my pleasure, Rene, and I think this might be the point at which we've covered your story in a rather a quick canter.
No problems. Thank you very